When you picture ancient Egyptian art, what pops into your head? You're probably thinking of giant pyramids, the Sphinx, maybe some of those famous golden masks, right? Well, today we are going way beyond that. We're going to peel back the layers on 3,000 years of history, and I promise you, it's a story of evolution, revolution, and a legacy that literally shaped the world of art as we know it. All right, let's get into it. So let's just start with the biggest misconception out there. There's this common idea that Egyptian art was just static, that the style they started with is pretty much the style they ended with thousands of years later. But as you're about to see, that could not be more wrong. The story of Egyptian art isn't about standing still. It's a story of constant and sometimes radical change.
Okay, so to get any of this, you first have to understand one single crucial concept, Ma'at. Now, Ma'at is the idea of perfect cosmic harmony, balance, and order. To the Egyptians, this wasn't just some nice philosophical thought. No, this was the fundamental force holding the entire universe together. And all of their art, every single piece, was an attempt to capture and reflect this perfect, balanced world of the gods.
So, keeping that core concept of Ma'at in your head, let's dig into the absolute foundation of their art. What was it actually for? Because, in ancient Egypt, art wasn't just about making pretty things to look at. It always had a job to do. That's right, Egyptian art was always first and foremost functional. It didn't matter how beautiful a statue was, its main job was to be a physical house for a god or a person's spirit. An amulet wasn't just jewelry, it was a piece of powerful, magical protection. In Egypt, beauty was never just for beauty's sake. It was a tool, and it was there to serve a critical spiritual purpose. All right, so now that we get that art had a function, let's see how that plays out in the first great era of Egyptian history. We're jumping into what a lot of people think of as the classic period, the Old Kingdom. Yeah, this is the age of the pyramid builders. You see, during the Old Kingdom, Egypt had this incredibly powerful centralized government and a really prosperous economy. And that combination of stability and wealth is exactly what allowed them to create these absolutely massive, monumental works that we still can't believe exist today, like the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx. So what did the art from this time actually look like? Well, because it was all state mandated, meaning the pharaoh or some super important noble commissioned it, the style was incredibly uniform. Artists had to follow a very strict set of rules. Kings were never shown looking old or weak. Nope, they were always perfect, youthful, powerful, completely idealized figures. And that's why the art from this time can look so static and unchanging for hundreds of years. And this slide right here shows you exactly what we're talking about. On the left, that's King Djoser. On the right, King Khufu, who was sculpted decades later. But just look at them. Notice the identical, rigid, formal posture? See how both faces are perfectly symmetrical and young with zero signs of age? This wasn't because the artists weren't creative. It was a very deliberate choice. This was the visual language of timeless divine power, and it was enforced by the state. But what happens when that powerful central government just disappears? Well, the Old Kingdom eventually collapsed, and that ushered in a period that would completely, and I mean completely, upend the Egyptian art world. For a really long time, historians actually called this next phase, the First Intermediate Period, a Dark Age. They would point to the art, which was no longer uniform or monumental, and they used it as proof that the entire culture was just falling apart in chaos. But was it really a Dark Age? And here is the big twist. The art wasn't lower quality. It was just different. See, without a king in the capital dictating one single style, artists all over Egypt were suddenly free. The change in the art wasn't a symptom of chaos, it was the direct result of brand new artistic freedom. This period was an absolute explosion of creativity. All of a sudden, different regions started developing their own unique artistic visions. And for the very first time, art became way more accessible. Things like Shopti dolls, those are little figures that were supposed to do your work for you in the afterlife, were suddenly being mass-produced, so they were affordable for people who weren't just the mega-rich. It was basically the democratization of art. Okay, so after this big burst of regional creativity, Egypt was eventually unified again, first in the Middle Kingdom and then in the New Kingdom. But the art didn't just snap back to the old, rigid rules. No way. Instead, artists created something completely new by blending that monumental tradition of the Old Kingdom with the expressive freedom they'd all just discovered. This slide just illustrates that shift perfectly. On the left, you've got that classic Old Kingdom style, perfect, godlike, eternally young. But now, look at the portrait on the right. That's a king from the Middle Kingdom. You can see the lines on his face, the bags under his eyes. He looks weary, careworn. This wasn't a mistake. It was a powerful statement. It reflected a massive shift in how they thought about kingship. The pharaoh wasn't just some distant god anymore. He was the shepherd of his people, a real human carrying the weight of the kingdom. This was a radical step toward realism. The New Kingdom is the age of empire, and it's probably the most famous period. As Egypt's borders expanded, artists got exposed to all sorts of new ideas and techniques. You have the radical pharaoh Akhenaten, who pushed realism to its absolute limits during what's called the Amarna period. And of course, you get the incredible treasures from Tutankhamun's tomb, which show off these amazing metalworking skills that the Egyptians actually learned from their neighbors, the Hittites. But the story doesn't end there. Not at all. Egyptian art kept evolving, absorbing new ideas, and influencing other great civilizations for hundreds of years to come. So, during the Ptolemaic period, which is after Alexander the Great's conquest, Egyptian art starts to fuse with Greek styles. This cultural blending created some incredible new works of art, and even new gods, like Serapis, who was basically a mashup of Greek and Egyptian deities.
And then the Romans continued this tradition. When they took over, they didn't just get rid of Egyptian culture, they adapted it. Just look at this incredible mummy portrait. That lifelike painted face is distinctly Roman in its style, but its purpose, to be placed over the face of a mummy, is purely Egyptian. It's a perfect fusion of two cultures.
There's this quote from the Egyptologist David P. Silverman that just perfectly captures the spirit of these later periods. It really was a constant balancing act, this creative tension between honoring thousands of years of tradition while at the same time embracing the forces of change. And that brings us to a final, pretty wild thought. For over 3,000 years, Egyptian art basically provided the rulebook, a whole system of representation that defined what art even was. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that artists like Picasso came along and intentionally tried to break away from that ancient tradition. So the question is, could the whole concept of modern art, an art that's defined by its break from the past, even exist without that incredibly long-lasting and powerful system that the ancient Egyptians created in the first place? It's something to think about. Thanks for watching.